Well, during his time as the Governor General of Canada, the Right Honourable David Johnston met his fair share of people, from astronauts to athletes and artists, even playing host to the royal family. Lucky guy. He has led dozens of delegations of Canadians to 35 countries on every continent except Antarctica. And through it all, he has learned valuable lessons in trust, lessons that he's now sharing with all of us in his brand new book. We welcome the Right Honourable David Johnston back to our Your Morning studios to share. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Anne-Marie. And now I realize that Antarctica has got to be on the bucket list.
There you go. We've got to add it in. I'm curious about why you wrote this book now. And I wonder if it's because, is this your anecdote to what we're seeing south of the border in a Trump America, or even nationally or globally what we're seeing about nationalism? Because it reads a bit as a warning.
We wrote it because I'm worried. Worried at the kind of international level, worried at the macro level, economics, politics, worried about my country, and worried about what our children learn and how they grow. And beyond that warning and that worry, I'm very hopeful about this special country, Canada, which I think we have to work to make very successful, not in a arrogant, show-offy way, but because you build a society around trust and good things happen.
You also focus on some solid advice from someone very wise, from your grandmother, who said, and I love this, you were given 2 ears and 1 mouth for a good reason. Talk to us about the importance of listening when it comes to trust.
We have 20 chapters in the book, Anne-Marie, and it's an arc that it actually began as a book that we entitled Trust in Canada. And it was really focused on our public institutions, on our media, on our rule of law, those kind of macro things. And as we began telling the story, it moved from those generalized, broad public areas into how we operate within our organization, within our team, within our school, et cetera, and then how we operate ourselves in terms of leadership. So the first part is how we make ourselves more trustworthy, how we build trust around us, and then how we deal with the broader public issues. And so, particularly in terms of the personal characteristics, you learn those lessons sort of from home. And my grandmother was a very wise person. And she said, as I'm giving this long answer, listen first. She said, God gave you 2 eyes and 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And trust comes from listening first, because you establish a respectful empathy with the other person, where their views are quite important to you as well as your own.
Empathy can also lead to apologies. Yes. Talk to us about where apologies fit in when it comes to gaining trust. You include a chapter on apologizing, and you write in it in the context of Canada's Indigenous community and residential schools.
We thought a lot about that chapter. That's a chapter that we wrote 2 or 3 times. The other one, 3 or 4 times, we wrote 3 or 4 times was on faith, which is a difficult subject in a sense. With respect to the apology chapter, I think we concluded no book on trust about Canada would be appropriate if one didn't deal with
broken trust, really.
Right on. If one didn't deal with the last 200, 300 years of history with our First Nations and Indigenous people, and more particularly the residential schools. And so we tackled that challenging subject and said we begin with an apology, because it's clear that what happened there was simply wrong, a wrong policy for a long period of time. And you begin by saying it is wrong. It's the only chapter in the book where we quote fairly extensively from political statements, and we quote entirely the apology that Prime Minister Harper gave shortly after his government was elected in 2010 in the House, and then a more detailed statement by Prime Minister Trudeau shortly after his government was elected. So that if you're going to reestablish trust, you have to begin by acknowledging wrong, clearly, fully, and then you move to the step of reconciliation. And that's the journey we're on now.
One of my favorite chapters that you include is the one on being true to yourself. You give this great story about yourself as a Harvard University student. You resigned from a club because they wouldn't allow a black man to be a member. I'm curious about your answer to this question. In being true to yourself, you have to know your values and act in them. And we look at, Madame Payette, who is the current Governor General of Canada. She is true to herself. She's a woman of science, a woman of strong opinions, but she has had difficulty so far in her term in gaining the trust of Canadians. So what would your advice be then in repairing and rebuilding that relationship of trust?
Well, I wouldn't comment on that specific situation, but I would say, with each person who occupies the office of Governor General, they bring their own values, their own personality, their own orientation, and it's a complex job, and it takes time to figure that out and to make the appropriate adjustments, including the matters you prioritize. In my case, that chapter is entitled "To Thine Own Self Be True," and actually that line is taken from Hamlet. It's early on in Act One, and it's Polonius who plays the fool in this play. And in many of Shakespeare's plays, there's a fool, and the fool is the wisest person on the stage. Mm-hmm. And he's giving advice to his son Laertes, who is going off from Denmark to Germany to, today we'd say, to go to university, but for learning. And it's that famous statement where he says, "To thine own self be true, and it shall follow as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to anyone." And so you say, to what are you true? Well, you're true to your values. So at age 18, when I was part of an organization that we had only 5 of the 2,000 first-year students at Harvard, where I was, who were Afro-American. This was well before the Civil Rights Movement, or somewhat before.
Right.
And the proposal was for a young man from Africa, a wonderful soccer player, to be admitted to the club. And they had to take a vote because there had not been a Afro-American, a black person in the club before. And it was voted down, and I'm not sure whether it was a small number of votes, 3 or 4, but it was because the alumni wouldn't support the club financially because they weren't ready for that. And so I resigned, not out of any indignation and not attempting to be protest, but I simply wasn't comfortable. And it was a difficult circumstances because my friend says, "Why would you do this?" And I said, "Look, I'm not here to tell you how you conduct yourself, but I grew up in a little town in Northern Ontario, and this just doesn't fit well with me, and so I'm not protesting, I'm just leaving that scene." And I guess a little later I began to discover that you have to take decisions that are based on your value system, and that's your moral compass.
It is one of the best books I've read on leadership. Thank you for writing it and for coming in to share some of the stories with us today.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you.